Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, fearless explorer who rediscovered two of the ancient world's most awe-inspiring sites, the lost city of Petra in Jordan and the colossal statues of Rameses II at Abu Simbel in Egypt. Dedicated to seeking out the hidden corners of forbidden lands and willing to put his life on the line to do so. But what made a young man from a wealthy Swiss family devote his life to venturing into unknown countries that were so famously hostile to outsiders? I'm Professor Graham Yorston, and today I'm at the ancient Nabatean city of Petra in modern-day Jordan, and I'm going to be talking about the fascinating story of the man who rediscovered it in 1812, a real-life Indiana Jones. In 1812, most of Europe was busy wondering what to do about Napoleon's march on Russia, although Britain also had to respond to the United States' invasion of Canada and continue fighting the long-drawn-out Peninsular War. In contrast, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was relatively quiet. It had been losing territory in the Balkans for some time, but the new Sultan, Mahmud II, was trying hard to reform and modernise his country. The Holy Land at this time had been part of the Ottoman Empire for 300 years, but the sultans in faraway Istanbul had shown little interest in the region, allowing it to slide into virtual anarchy, with rival Bedouin tribes fighting amongst themselves. Before the Ottomans, it had been ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and before the Mamluks, by the Ayyubid dynasty of Saladin the Magnificent, who finally defeated the Crusaders in 1187 after centuries of war. It was against this backdrop that Johann Burckhardt, disguised as an Indian Muslim, supposedly working for an English trading company on his way from Syria to Egypt, decided to take a detour, to follow up rumours of a lost city in the desert, close to the ancient King's Highway. He'd already been fleeced of most of his belongings, stripped naked and left for dead by his guides as he headed south through Damascus, the Roman ruins of Jerash and Amman, and the Crusader castles of Kerak and Shubak. But as was his way, he unassumingly set about hiring a new Bedouin guide, paying him with a pair of old horseshoes, and asked to be taken to the tomb of Harun, the Arabic name of Aaron, the brother of Moses, an important prophet in Islam, so a believable detour for an Islamic traveller. The only route to the tomb then, as now, would have taken him through the Siq, the cool, narrow gorge that winds for nearly a mile, described by Burckhardt in his journals as a gloomy and almost subterraneous passage, which suddenly opens up to reveal the breathtaking sight of what is now called the Treasury, because it was once believed by the local people to contain hidden treasures, but at the time it was known as Casa Pharaon, the Pharaoh's castle. Burckhardt realised immediately it was a tomb and commented, "Great must have been the opulence of the city which could dedicate such monuments to the memory of its rulers." Today, even thronged with tourists and pungent with the smell of camel dung, the incredible Rose City of Petra, carved from the living rock 2,000 years ago, yet looking as fresh as if it were completed last week, is an amazing sight. It is a true bucket list destination, and it doesn't disappoint. When Burckhardt caught his first glimpse of it in 1812, the first European to have done so for over 600 years, he could only spend a few tantalising moments taking it in and peeking inside. Otherwise, he would have raised suspicions that he was not the trader he claimed to be and faced certain death as a foreign spy. So he secretly scribbled a few notes and walked on past the amphitheatre and the 50 other tombs he saw cut into the desert cliffs. Even though he did his best to curb his excitement and desire to explore the tombs, his guide suspected he was an infidel and a treasure hunter, and he had great difficulty persuading him otherwise. They continued on the path to Aaron's tomb, passing the other ruined buildings and monuments, reaching the plateau after nightfall. In sight of the tomb, he sacrificed and roasted a goat and camped out for the night, before continuing his journey onto Cairo, traversing the Sinai Desert on camel, like Lawrence of Arabia 100 years later. So who was this strange young man, willing to risk his life travelling amongst the mysterious peoples of Arabia to uncover the ruins of ancient empires? John Lewis, Jean-Louis, or Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was born in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1784. His family were wealthy silk merchants, and his childhood was spent in a luxurious mansion in Basel, now a museum, with the summer months at the country estate at Ernsthalde. But his childhood bliss was ended when Napoleon invaded Switzerland in 1798, and centuries of tradition and independence were swept away by the Emperor of the French. Rudolf Burckhardt, his father, a vociferous critic of all things Napoleonic, was arrested for treason, and Ludwig escaped to Leipzig University at the age of 16. He had a wide range of interests and studied lots of different subjects, and he seems to have enjoyed himself in his 4 years in Leipzig. Rather too much, in fact, and he was deeply ashamed to have to ask his parents to pay off his debts and determined never to have to ask them for money again. He spent a further year at Göttingen University and gained a reputation for his zeal for knowledge. French power in Europe was growing and would soon encompass most of Germany. Burckhardt shared his father's dislike of Napoleon and was keen to move to a country which was standing up to the Corsican fiend to assist in any way he could. He arrived in London in 1805 at the age of 21 with high hopes. A cousin had promised to find him work in the diplomatic or civil service, but things did not go according to plan. His cousin disappeared, no job materialised, and he lived in abject poverty, trying to maintain appearances as a man of means to secure employment, but surviving on bread and cheese. He did not complain or ask his parents for funds, and later described the whole experience as instructive. This unsatisfactory situation dragged on for over 2 years, but in 1808 he found a job with the African Association, a London club founded in 1788 to promote the discovery of the interior parts of Africa, partly for scientific reasons and partly for commercial exploitation. One of its key missions was to establish the course of the Niger River, which baffled geographers as it seemed to flow inland, away from the sea, towards the fabled city of Timbuktu, once the capital of the Mali Empire, and its king Mansa Musa said to have been the richest man alive, rich from the profits of the trans-Saharan trade in gold, salt, ivory, and slaves. The African Association had dispatched several other keen young men into the heart of Africa, including Mungo Park, who had encountered hostile natives and never returned. A new expedition was proposed for an overland journey from Cairo to Timbuktu, and Burckhardt was hired for the job. He spent several months at Cambridge studying Arabic and attending lectures on chemistry, astronomy, and medicine. He was described by Edward Clarke, one of the professors, who had himself visited Egypt, as a retiring man with a naturally grave character. But through his kindness, Clarke was able to penetrate the mask of solemnity to see his true worth. Burckhardt tried to harden his constitution by taking 13-hour walks bareheaded during an exceptional heatwave, sleeping on the ground and living frugally on a diet of vegetables. He also started wearing Arabian costume full-time in Cambridge and must have seemed a very odd character. In early 1809 he sailed for Malta, but he was stuck for weeks awaiting his next ship. He didn't waste his time, however, studying hard to improve his Arabic. He also learned of Ulrich Seetzen, a German explorer of the Middle East who had walked around the Dead Sea alone, disguised as a beggar, searching for the lost city of Petra, wealthy capital of the Roman province of Arabia Petraea, known only through historical texts such as Eusebius of Caesarea's Omnasticon, written in 324. Burckhardt remained in disguise as Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah throughout his time in Malta. So great was his fear that rumours might spread of a foreigner travelling to Syria, which could endanger his mission and his life. He hoped that his ruse of being an Indian trader would explain any imperfections in his speech, and if asked to speak in his native tongue, he planned to launch into broad Swiss-German dialect in the hope that his listeners would be none the wiser. Finally, after almost 2 months, a ship embarked for Syria. But troubles beset him from the start. An unsavoury ship's captain deposited him at the wrong port, and his Indian disguise did not save him from some unpleasant treatment as a Jiao, or infidel. But he managed to make his way by caravan to Aleppo, where he spent the next 2 years studying the language, customs and religion and discussing the complexities of Islamic law with Muslim scholars. To test the effectiveness of his disguise, he made excursions to Damascus and the ruins of Palmyra, and Baalbek, often sleeping on the ground and eating with the camel drivers. He ran into all sorts of difficulties as tensions were high in the region due to the Wahhabi revolt, Islamic fundamentalists trying to shake off Ottoman rule, and he was deserted by his guides and robbed of his belongings on more than one occasion. He studied Arabic and the local dialects and discovered what he thought were Hittite hieroglyphs, but which later turned out to be pictographs of the ancient Anatolian language of Luvian. In early 1812, when he felt he could travel safely without arousing suspicion, he set off for Cairo. And it was several months into this journey that he made his all too brief visit to Petra. He arrived in Cairo in September and immediately set about trying to join a pilgrim caravan to Fezzan in southern Libya, from where he hoped to travel on to Timbuktu. But difficult weather conditions in the Sahara and a series of plagues across Arabia and North Africa meant nothing was moving. So, rather than waste his time waiting, and aware that the customs of Egypt and Libya were different to those of Syria, he decided to spend longer in Egypt to acquaint himself with them. And he made an expedition up the Nile by donkey to see the monuments and check out the trade routes. He set out in January 1813 and reached almost as far as Dongola in what is now Sudan, before his progress was blocked by hostile locals. On his return journey, he came across the sand-choked ruins of the great temple of Rameses II at Abu Simbel. He later told his friend Giovanni Belzoni, known as the Great Belzoni, the Italian circus strongman turned Egyptologist, about what he'd seen, and Belzoni returned a few years later to properly excavate the site. In 1814, still with no prospect of finding a caravan to Fezzan, he made a second journey south into the Sudan and Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. He spent a month in Shendi, where there was a large slave market. Burckhardt described the slave trade in detail and estimated the total number of slaves in Egypt at around 40,000, saying there was scarcely a village without at least one or two slaves, and every man of wealth owned at least one. Burckhardt described the treatment of the slaves in detail, writing, "I frequently witnessed scenes of the most shameless indecency, which the traders, who were the principal actors, only laughed at. I may venture to state that very few female slaves who have passed their 10th year reach Egypt or Arabia in a state of virginity." He arrived at the Red Sea port of Suakin after 4 months in July, the hottest time of the year, with temperatures reaching almost 50 degrees Celsius or 120 degrees Fahrenheit. From there, he crossed the Red Sea to Jeddah in Arabia. He was ill with fever, had almost no money left, and his clothes were ragged from spending months in the desert. Fortunately, Muhammad Ali, the Viceroy of Egypt, who was in Arabia at the time fighting the Wahhabi rebels at the request of the Sultan, heard of the arrival of the by now famous traveller and summoned him to his presence and relieved him of his difficulties. Burckhardt expressed a wish to visit Mecca as a pilgrim, and the Pasha, although well aware of his nationality, consented, provided he could satisfy a committee of Muslim examiners, which he did. He was therefore allowed to visit Mecca and perform all the rites of Hajj that any other pilgrim would, and this is the certificate that he was awarded to show he had done so. He also visited Medina, but here he was again prostrated by fever for several months before he eventually returned to Cairo in an exhausted condition. Months passed, and still the opportunity for his Niger exploration did not arise, so he spent his time fighting off further bouts of fever, probably malaria, and preparing the journals of his expeditions to send back to the African Association in London, and assisting in the excavations of the Great Belzoni. When bubonic plague appeared in 1816, he travelled to Suez and Sinai. The following year he was struck down again with dysentery, and 11 days later he died. He was 32 and never got anywhere near Timbuktu or the Niger River. In his will, He left detailed instructions bequeathing his collection of over 300 valuable manuscripts, along with his journals and notebooks, to Cambridge University. But he was rather casual about his burial arrangements, saying, "The Turks will take my body, leave it to them." He was buried in an Islamic cemetery close to the Victory Gate in Cairo, under his Eastern name of Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. Burckhardt was a popular hero in the 19th century. His detailed descriptions of the landscapes, towns and ancient monuments that he visited were an important source of information for later explorers well into the 20th century. But it is his descriptions of the everyday lives and customs of the peoples he met on his travels that remain invaluable. His non-judgmental tone is more typical of anthropological participant observation studies carried out over a century later by the likes of Margaret Mead in the South Pacific. All the more remarkable given that he had to jot down his observations secretly, under his cloak or behind a camel, for fear of exciting suspicion among his guides. You may be thinking at this point what any of this has to do with mental health. Well, before my trip to Jordan, I read a little about him, and it seemed that he was rather eccentric, and this, along with his single-mindedness, preference for keeping his own company, meticulousness in planning, and incredible attention to detail, raised the possibility in my mind that he might have had an autistic spectrum disorder. But having now read more about his life and his own writings, I am less certain. It is a possibility, but there are also references to him being affable and sociable, which would not really fit with such a diagnosis. The concept of autistic spectrum disorder is a relatively recent one. The term infantile autism was first used by American psychiatrist Leo Kanner in 1943 to describe 11 children who displayed a powerful desire for aloneness and an obsessive insistence on persistent sameness. Around the same time in Austria, Hans Asperger described children with difficulties in social interactions but normal intellectual functioning. And when his work was rediscovered in the 1980s by Lorna Wing, this combination came to be known as high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome. However, concerns over Asperger's possible connections to the Nazi extermination program of disabled children led to his name being dropped and the terms autistic spectrum disorder, ASD, or just on the spectrum being used instead. There are many controversies in the field of autism, and disability politics, important though it is, can sometimes cloud the science. Autistic spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder listed in the International Psychiatric Classification Systems, but many autistic people and advocates see autism as part of neurodiversity, the natural variation in human thinking and experiencing of the world, and not a disorder at all. My own view is that the traits that are associated with autism lie on a broad spectrum of severity. Those people with fewer or milder traits are able to live satisfying and fulfilling lives, and often excel at many things. But those with more profound problems who are distressed by their difficulties, or who are simply unable to function in everyday society, these people can be considered to have a disorder. Did Burckhardt have a disorder at the more severe end of the spectrum? Probably not. But were the choices he made in life and the quality of his work influenced by being on the spectrum? I think they probably were. And this is the perfect illustration of why diversity in all its forms should be welcomed and not feared or criminalised. People who are a bit different, who aren't interested in doing the same as everyone else, have pushed human civilization forwards from the dawn of time, and without them we might all still be sitting around campfires chewing on mammoth bones. But I'll leave the last words to Burckhardt himself. He wrote to his parents before he embarked on his travels, seeking to reassure them about the dangers he would be facing. "The fear of death has left me since I have been at ease with my conscience. I shall not hastily expose myself to death, but shall not be afraid either when I am faced by it. And am I really safer from it here, in my room, than I shall be on my journey?" Thank you for watching. I hope you like the backdrop. I really am here in Petra. It's not a green screen. I've got the flies and the camels and the donkeys walking past. So if you've enjoyed today's video, please subscribe and click the notifications bell to be kept up to date with all the latest videos. Bye for now.